welcome to the Shale Gas and Fracking Energy Evolution or Revolution speaker event. We're excited to have you all here today. These topics in particular have been very prevalent in the energy industry as of the past decade, and they've generated quite a bit of controversy. That's one of the main reasons why we've chosen to have a speaker series event today, in order to improve energy literacy. This event is being hosted by the IB Business Review and is being sponsored by the IB Energy Policy and Management Center. The goal of the IB Business Review is twofold: to provide students with a chance to voice their opinions on complex business issues before being constrained and molded by the corporate world, while also allowing students the opportunity to learn from those complex business issues. The speaker series stems from the second part of our goal, which allows you as students to get the opportunity to talk with industry leaders about current dynamics in their industry. So without further ado, let me introduce our two speakers. Mel Ydreos, our second speaker, serves as Executive Director at EnergyVantage and is the Interim President and CEO of the Ontario Energy Association. Mel also graduated from Waterloo with a degree in civil engineering. Mel also has held a number of executive positions at Union Gas, including VP of Aboriginal and Public Affairs, Vice President of Marketing, Vice President of Operations, and VP of Engineering. And finally, Mel has served on many task forces in relation to natural gas, but there's quite so many of them that it's too many to list in this short introduction. Both speakers bring a wealth of knowledge to this speaker series and this event, and they are well respected in their fields. We appreciate the time that they've taken for us today to educate us on natural gas and fracking. And without further ado, let's give them a more active welcome, and welcome our speakers, Steve Baker and Mel Ydreos.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Steve. Always great to hear you. Steve and I worked for many, many years together. EnergyVantage is my small consulting firm that I've set up after my successful career in Union Gas. And most of my work these days is international, even though I'm based in Toronto. And I'm here speaking on behalf of the International Gas Union. I have a leadership position with that organization. I'm currently the Vice Chairman of the Coordination Committee. In June, I will become the Chairman of the Coordination Committee. Coordination Committee is made up of about 1,000 professionals from around the world who work on policy, technical papers for the Union, and I will be overseeing their activities over the next 3 years. I'm also the global spokesperson for shale gas for the International Gas Union. And it's taken me to probably 20 different countries speaking about shale gas in the last 4 years. Very little in Ontario, so I'm glad to be home to talk about this subject. And the reason why I got into it, I never thought it was going to get this big, but it did get big for me, was the creation of this booklet. And this is an International Gas Union publication contextualizing the issues. It's about 3 years old now, 3.5 years. I put that together with actually a small team of very talented engineers from Union Gas at the time. It served its purpose extremely well. It's a different kind of paper. It's a type of paper where non-industry individual, a policymaker perhaps, can pick it up, read it, understand it because there are no technical terms, and contextualize the issues, predominantly the environmental issues, that have become such an emotional and controversial issue when it comes to shale gas extraction. It's been translated to 3 different languages and has been, sort of a top seller within the policy environments around the world, which I'm very, very pleased with. Out of that came then my position to go speak about it around the world, and that's how I've engaged with governments, conferences, debates around shale gas extraction. What I found when I got into it was that there were 2 extreme positions when it came to shale gas. On one hand, the industry proclaimed that the process was absolutely perfect, there was nothing wrong with it, there's nothing to be concerned about. And on the other hand, were the extreme attacks that distorted the truth to a certain extent and painted this picture of chaos about to happen because of shale gas extraction. There was absolutely no middle ground. And I thought the position that I could play, particularly because I come from the downstream side of the business, I never worked on the upstream side of the business. I hold no investments in the upstream side of the business. So I felt the middle ground, whereas we needed to get people to begin to talk seriously around this issue, because frankly, I have a belief that shale gas can be extracted safely and with the utmost respect for the environment. And by doing that, it has tremendous benefits globally to enhance people's lives because of the attributes that natural gas can provide, both in clean air in the megacities, as well as reducing carbon emissions. So that's how I got to this position. So I'm going to go very quickly through this presentation. I'm going to contextualize it a little bit about why this issue is so big around the world, and then talk a little bit about the environmental concerns, and hopefully get into a Q&A. So let's go to the next slide. First of all, the International Gas Union has 91 charter members, which means 91 countries are members of the International Gas Union. We also have 51 associate members. Those are typically the multinationals, the Shells, the ExxonMobils, Chevrons, Pemex, those organizations from around the world. So it's a very large organization, founded in 1931. Canada was actually one of the founding countries of the International Gas Union, and the Canadian representative on the International Gas Union is actually the Canadian Gas Association, represents Canada. So it's a global organization. The Secretariat is based in Oslo, Norway. Next slide, please. Now, I'm going to dig in a little bit on geology so you get a better appreciation of what shale is all about and why it is so damn difficult to access the rich resources that are trapped in shale formations. The biggest issue with shale gas is not only that it's very deep, but it's not pervious. It's a very hard rock. It's in the granite section of how tight it is. And just to contextualize it, sidewalk cement outside would fall sort of in the middle here. So it is multiple times harder than the cement sidewalk that we walk on. And somehow in there is rich resources trapped that we have to access. And the only way we can access them is if we successfully hydraulically fracture that formation. Let's go to the next slide. This is what the formation looks like. On the top, my left, is a core sample. You can see how granite-like it is, very tight formation. This slide over here is basically a 2-inch by 2-inch square, and it shows you the fractures or fissures that we're trying to create in the formation to release the hydrocarbons that are trapped in the formation. Now this one over here is probably the most interesting one. This is a cube that is less than the thickness of a strand of hair. We're now really looking at inside the formation. And what we find here is the following. All the gray is the rock. The whiter part is really what's been decaying for millions of years. And the darker spots are the hydrocarbons. But you can see what's interesting about this. These pores are not connected. There's no permeability. So what we're trying to do with hydraulic fracturing is create pathways to connect all these pores so that we come into the carrier pipe so that the hydrocarbon can come to the surface. And that's what hydraulic fracturing is all about. It's not about opening up huge gaping holes underground. It's about creating micro cracks that connect the pores of hydrocarbons so they come to the carrier pipe, so they come to the surface. Next slide. Now, in the beginning, 5 years ago, most people thought a shale is a shale. And you go drill into a shale, and you'll find a resource, and you'll get rich. The reality is, after many successes and failures, People have understood now that a shale is not a shale. And in fact, what I can say is there are no two shales alike. And in fact, there's no single shale formation that is alike throughout the formation. And these are generally the characteristics that are needed to economically extract the resource from shale formations. And these are important elements that work. One of those that doesn't work, you probably will not be able to extract the resource. The other thing you have to appreciate is zone thickness, the second one. In North America, we go down 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers deep to get into a formation that's somewhere between 25 and 100 meters. And in that formation, we go horizontally up to 1 mile or 1 kilometer, 1.5 kilometers. The level of precision, the level of technology that's required to do that is astounding. And in fact, I would say this much, that the shale gas revolution has been one of the most phenomenal technological advances we've had in energy over the last decade, but it's a story that hasn't been told. And the innovations continue today, and they're tremendous innovations that make the resource extraction more economic and less impactful to the environment. Let's go to the next. So, what does the process look like? Well, after years of assessment of a play, and once you decide to drill a well, this is what happens to single well drilling. 2 to 4 weeks to set up your platform. The actual hydraulic fracturing is a process that lasts 3, 4, perhaps 5 days in total. And then you finish off the well, and then you produce for 40 to 50 years. That's really what it looks like. However, innovation again, we no longer drill single wells. We drill multi-well pads, where you can get up to 12 wells being drilled together on a single pad. And that increases efficiency, productivity, reduces track movement, noise levels, etc., which is very, very important, which was one of the issues early in the process of shale gas extraction. Next. So, why is it such a big deal? Well, it's a big deal because there's a lot of shale resources around the world. And what's interesting about the shale resources around the world is they're dispersed. They're not just in one place. So shale gas has the ability and the opportunity for redefining producing and consuming nations because of how widespread it is. It's in North America, in South America, it's in Europe, it's in Africa, it's in Asia, it is all over the world. Now, currently, there are only 3 countries that produce shale gas commercially. So a long ways to go for all these other countries, and I'll talk about some of the issues. Next. Now, this slide is pretty interesting, because what it says to you is that there's actually more shale gas resource in the ground than conventional gas. And that's why it becomes very important. If we're able to tap into that gas, we have a supply of over 250 years of natural gas. Next. Now, the North American shale plays. Currently, there's 32 states in the U.S. that are involved in the extraction of shale gas. We also have 3 provinces in Canada that are involved in shale gas extraction. We have a number of moratoriums as well in Canada and the U.S. But this is what it looks like. It's vast. It's widespread. The Marcellus here on the top end is the most prolific play, and it's just south of Ontario. So geographically, it's very close to Ontario. And what's interesting about the Marcellus is it has really turned the whole transmission system of North America upside down. Where we used to rely on gas from Western Canada to flow to the east, we now have a huge formation blocking that in between. And therefore, all the shifts in gas, in fact, we're seeing Marcellus gas come into Ontario and into Quebec versus Western Canadian gas. Why? Because it happens to be 2,000 kilometers shorter in distance, and therefore a lot more cost effective to bring it across the border this is the Marcellus is a phenomenal field, and you can see the growth. This is back to sort of 2000 and mid-2000s. It's been an extraordinary development of this production field. And what's most impressive is actually this chart on the right, which talks about the innovation and the tremendous efficiency that is being implemented now. The black line is the number of rigs that are working in the Marcellus. The blue line is the production per rig. Tremendous growth in production per rig, which then allowed the number of rigs to decline. So when you see in the news, oh, number of rigs have declined, your first impression is, okay, then production must be down or it's getting more difficult. In fact, what's happening is productivity has significantly increased, so you don't need as many rigs to be drilling as you do now. Next. The European shale thing is a real interesting one because Europe has a lot of shale, but Europe has a lot of moratoriums, particularly France was the first country to declare a moratorium. Germany followed, although Germany is about to lift its moratorium as they're working through their regulatory process. But there's a lot of shale in Europe. Some disappointment, Poland particularly, where the geology, they've tried really hard to develop shale in Poland. Geology is just not on their side. But still, when you hear about Europe's dependence on Russian gas, and one of the ways of getting less dependent on Russian gas is LNG, liquefied natural gas, delivered to Europe, but also development of shale gas could lead to less dependence on Russian gas. Next. I want to play you a little bit of a video.
As global reserves of fossil fuels dwindle, the oil and gas industry has turned to fracking, a more dangerous and expensive extraction method that threatens our climate. Hydraulic fracturing, called fracking, is a way to access natural gas out of rock deep in the earth. Fossil fuel companies can frack anywhere, from wilderness to people's backyards. The process starts by drilling sometimes more than a mile deep to get to shale rock. Then fracking fluids are injected. This toxic cocktail requires millions of gallons of fresh water, mixed with some of over 600 chemicals, including known carcinogens like lead, formaldehyde, and even more the fossil fuel industry won't disclose. Under high pressure, the rock fractures, sending the trapped methane gas back up the well. Most of the fracking fluid stays underground. The fluid that comes back up is either dumped into rivers, left in open pits that contaminate the air, or hauled away by big rigs. The toxic fracking fluid that stays underground becomes even more toxic over time as it picks up radioactivity and other contaminants. Those fluids and gases can then seep into aquifers, which provide irrigation for farming, and turns drinking water into a toxic mix. The industry conceals the exact amount of methane that escapes during fracking. But in North Dakota, where fracking is done primarily for oil, the methane is released and burned off in such great amounts that it's visible from space. Methane is a super pollutant. It's 86 times more disruptive to our climate than the carbon dioxide from coal-burning power plants. Air and water pollution from fracking leads to respiratory and nervous system problems and other diseases, including cancer. When you add up the climate disruption, air pollution, poisoned water, and the damage to our health from fracking, it's clear natural gas is just another dirty fossil fuel, and we should leave it in the ground. We can power America with 100% clean energy like wind and solar. It's time to invest in solutions that move America beyond natural gas.
This was released this past December by the Sierra. We're not talking about a film that was produced 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. This was December last year. And this is the extreme sensationalization of a process that occurs, but regrettably shapes opinion. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how extreme some of these positions are in the next couple of minutes as I move through. So, as we saw in the film, we draw, to get into the resource, we basically drill down a kilometer, 2 kilometers, depending how deep, 3 kilometers, depending how deep the formation is. And then you go horizontal. We've been able to move the drill bit. So instead of going vertically down, we can actually move it and go horizontally across the formation. And we can go a kilometer horizontally. And why that's important? It's important because it increases the payload of the formation. Because remember, these formations are very, very thin in relative terms. And then what we do is, in stages, we inject, under pressure, water, sand, and additives, these toxic chemicals that the film talks about. And that's what fracks the structure. And that releases the methane and brings it to the surface. When you do that, when you do the hydraulic fracturing job, in the next 2 days, after you're finished, 2 days, I'm not talking about 2 weeks, 2 days, about 40% of the water that you used to fracture the formation comes back up. The rest stays down there, as the film suggested, and it comes up over the next 50 years in very, very small quantities. So you have to contextualize that. Okay? Now, biggest issue that anybody has is water contamination from aquifers. It is absolutely the most important issue that the industry cares about, that everybody should care about. And I totally agree with that. First of all, the notion that somehow some fracturing 2 or 3 kilometers below an aquifer that's only 100 meters from the surface will seep up through all this rock formation and contaminate an aquifer is far-fetched. What's important, though, is when we go through the aquifer, that we construct our casings in a way that ensures that when the liquid, particularly in those 2 days, comes up, doesn't get into the aquifer. Now, what's interesting about the way we do that, we've been drilling vertical wells for 100 years. It's a process that has been innovated, improved over 100 years. And there's multiple layers and cementing that goes on that protects that. So remember that. However, at the end of the day, we're talking about an industrial process. Things can go wrong. Human error can occur. Material defects can occur. So those things are possible. However, risk is about probability and consequence. The probability of something going wrong is extremely small. So you have to, again, consider it within the context of what do we get out of it versus the risk. The risk is not zero, and I would never stand up here and say the risk is absolutely zero, because that's not a fair assessment. However, it is extremely low. I get on an airplane every week. I know what the consequence is if something goes wrong, but I still get on that airplane every week. That's the analogy sort of I'll use. As catastrophic as what might happen to me in an airplane is, I still take that risk. So I want you to sort of think through that. Let's go to the next slide. Hydraulic fracturing fluids. The film makes reference to 600 toxic chemicals. First of all, the hydraulic fluid mixture contains somewhere between 8 to 12 additives. That's it. Now, are there 600 combinations of those 8 to 12 additives? There are. But in reality, 90% is water, 99% is water, 90% water, 9.5% is sand, and sand is necessary because it needs to keep those fractures open. It's the sand that keeps, when we crack the formation, it's the sand that keeps those micro cracks open to allow the gas to escape through. 0.50% are the additives. And the additives are typically the types of things you find in your home. They're not these toxic things that everybody talks about, okay? And what's interesting is that when you look at the concentration, that's a typical fluid mixture. When you look at the concentrations, they're extremely low. I live downtown Toronto. I live in Leslieville. The city of Toronto tests my water once in a while for lead. You know why? Because the pipes are lead. It's an old part of the city. There are acceptable levels of how much lead my drinking water can contain. So there are standards that are complied to with respect to how much of these additives you can put. And as long as those concentrations are below the acceptable and approved guidelines, then it's fine. It's not this toxic mixture that everybody talks about. And the industry is innovating. They're going green. More and more, we're seeing the substitution of these ingredients to much more greener ingredients. Now, the other point is disclosure is the other thing that everybody talks about. Secretive. Well, there are trade secrets, and there are laws around trade secrets that society has put into place for competitive advantage. In the beginning, the industry refused to disclose anything because they viewed it as a competitive advantage, trademark sort of thing. We've come a long way. Since January 1st, 2012, in British Columbia, there's full disclosure by well what the mixture is. You can go to the website, Frack Focus. You can go to the well site in your community. You can click on it. A PDF comes on, lists all of the ingredients that are being used in the information. The U.S. has done it more on a voluntary basis. I checked it this morning. There's about 100,000 wells that have been registered, even on a voluntary basis. Next. Water use is another huge issue. That there's massive amounts of water being used in fracturing. The reality is, when you really look at the liters of water used per energy output you get, it is actually quite a bit less than coal, than nuclear, conventional oil, than any of the other energy, traditional energy sources. Now, there is an argument to be made, and I agree with it. The difference here is that most people say, well, you're taking that water out of the ecosystem and putting it underground. Since you only get 40% coming back, it's going to take 50 years to get the rest of it. So in reality, you're depleting water from the ecosystem. And I agree with that comment. That's why the industry is moving aggressively to recycling. So what happens is the backflow, that 40% that comes back, gets recycled and used into the next fracking job. One step, go to the next step, let's go to the next slide. So this is what happens. It gets dumped into rivers. Like, are they serious? You think it's like, would anybody really believe that anybody would just simply dump something into a river? Now, things do get dumped into the river after they're treated, after they go through municipal treatment plants. That's what happens to the waste in communities. Now, Shell in northern BC did one step further. They invested $14 million and expanded the wastewater treatment plant and are producing the water they're using for hydraulic fracturing from groundwater of the community. So there's absolutely no tapping into any extra water. They're actually turning groundwater into usable fracking water by shipping it by pipeline 50 kilometers to the frac site. Now, this is very innovative. This is leading edge as far as I'm concerned, and probably the only one of this example. But those are the types of innovations and examples that are being used in the industry. Excellent. The next thing, and probably the one that has the most hysteria around it, is earthquakes. Now, I hear this a lot. Now, I grew up in a country where earthquakes were kind of everyday occurrence. Not every day, but every month. And I remember I was in Chatham one day, and there was a bit of a shake. It was the first time since I immigrated to Canada where I actually felt an earthquake. And I stepped out of my office, and I thought this was amazing. And finally, I looked around, everybody's underneath their tables. What's going on here? When you're not used to an earthquake or a bit of a shake, you react quite interestingly the first time you experience it. Let me tell you this. Through measurements taken on hydraulic fracturing sites, this happened to be measurement in Quebec by Apache. When you hydraulically fracture a well and you're 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers underground, the level of shake or seismic event that occurs on the surface is some 100,000 times lower than what is detectable at the surface. I was in Warsaw. The comment made by the Polish was that the great earthquake in Fiji registered higher than the fracking operations in Poland. Now, does that mean that there is no earthquakes? No. Are they possible? Yes. If you're not careful, you can induce an earthquake. There has been a Richter scale 4 is when you begin to feel an earthquake. Not that there's any damage. There's never been any damage. So you can get earthquakes at 2.5, 3, 3.5. They're not even felt. At 4 is when you begin to feel an earthquake. Most of the induced earthquakes related to shale gas extraction have come from disposal of wastewater into deep wells. Now what's happened is they dispose this backflow into deep wells, and if you dispose it too rapidly, you build up a head column, a pressure column. And if there's any, if you're near some faults, it has the ability to shift the fault slightly. And if that happens, you get a bit of a shake. Most of them, in fact, only one that I'm aware of, has been more than Richter scale 4. Now, 2 weeks ago, out west, we had one at 4.4. And the regulator stepped in and said, okay, you have to monitor seismic activity while you're fracking, and if anything exceeds 4, you have to stop the operation. And that's how the regulator moved in very quickly. So it can happen, particularly if you're fracking near fault lines. So seismology becomes very, very important, and innovations in seismology have really, really advanced. Chevron has devised this 4-plate system that is able to detect exact location of fault lines to avoid fracking near these fault lines. Next. The biggest, probably, issue right now is methane emissions, and the claim that somehow shale gas extraction, in fact the whole industry, is emitting a lot more methane than it has told people. And if the leakage levels are high enough, the value of natural gas burned at a power plant may be less than what we thought previously, and it may be that burning coal is actually better than burning natural gas. And it was all led by some work out of Cornell University done by Professor Howarth. When he issued his report and showed conventional low and high and shale low and high that were off the scale. And people wonder, where did this come from, and how did he conclude that there's so much damage to the environment from methane released from shale gas? So a number of studies were initiated. In fact, one out of Cornell. And there's been at least 8 studies that have taken apart Professor Howarth's work and pointed to the major errors he made in the assumptions that he used in his calculations. And they all concluded, as you can see here, that these are the levels, not as Mr. Howard suggested. Now, it's incumbent upon the industry to focus on methane leakage and emissions, because it has become actually quite a hot issue, and there's a significant amount of work being done to improve the process. Most people are trying to position it as new work. The reality is that work has been going on for years, because as Steve said, the industry is very concerned about that and has been taking steps to improve its environmental footprint for many, many years. So I'm going to stop there. Hopefully we'll have a bit of a Q&A and explore some of these issues. Great. Thank you.